Declan, the ledger. Corwin had a name whispered in Liverpool's alleys and boardrooms alike, a man who turned cocaine into millions and built an empire hidden behind cafes, tattoo studios, and luxury mansions. Hugo Vance, his trusted accountant, held the keys to secrets Declan believed were untouchable. This is the story of money, mansions, and madness, the rise and fall of Liverpool's most cunning cocaine kingpin. Liverpool's docks had always been a hub of activity, a place where trade, ships, and commerce collided in a constant rhythm. For most, it was just part of the city's history, a bustling port where goods came and went, sometimes disappearing as quickly as they arrived. But for a new kind of entrepreneur emerging in the shadows, the docks offered something far more lucrative than shipments of fish or imported textiles. They were the gateway to a criminal empire. Declan, the ledger Corwin, wasn't born into crime, and he wasn't the stereotypical street dealer. In his early 30s, he carried himself with a quiet, deliberate precision that made him almost invisible in the chaotic rhythm of Liverpool's underworld. On the surface, he was unremarkable, neatly dressed, polite when needed, and cautious enough to avoid attention. But underneath that calm exterior was a man obsessed with one thing: money. Not just money itself, but money that appeared clean, legitimate, untouchable. Declan's early years were marked by small ventures, seemingly harmless jobs that taught him patience, observation, and control. He worked briefly in accounting firms, learning the delicate art of spreadsheets and corporate ledgers. He spent evenings poring over business manuals, legal structures, and offshore banking guides, memorizing every loophole and tactic that could conceal wealth. While other young men on the streets chased quick thrills, Declan's ambitions were far larger. He wasn't content to be just another dealer. He wanted to be untouchable, a shadow who could command power without ever stepping into the spotlight. His first foray into serious crime began quietly. A small cocaine operation in Liverpool's nightlife scene gave him the initial capital, but even at this stage, he thought like an accountant more than a dealer. Each transaction was calculated, each payment tracked meticulously, not in a notebook in a pocket, but in complex spreadsheets and coded messages that only he could understand. As his network of couriers and suppliers grew, so did his fascination with turning illicit gains into something that could blend seamlessly with the legitimate world. The first step in this transformation was deceptively simple: laundrettes. On the surface, they were ordinary businesses in working-class neighborhoods, machines whirring, soap scents in the air, a place where locals dropped off their clothes. But to Declan, they were gold mines. Cash from drug sales, sometimes in staggering amounts, flowed into the tills and was carefully recorded as service revenue. The physical presence of coins and notes made the operation tangible, yet the system was designed so that banks, auditors, and local authorities saw nothing suspicious. Each laundrette was registered under a different name, each with its own seemingly independent accounting, creating layers that masked the origin of the money. By the time Declan reached his late 20s, he had already built a network that many would have considered impossible. Couriers who could move drugs unnoticed, accountants who could disguise illicit payments as ordinary business income, and enforcers who ensured loyalty and silence. But what made Declan truly dangerous was his invisibility. He did not operate from the streets or the clubs where deals were made. He did not flaunt his wealth openly. Instead, he moved quietly, orchestrating complex operations from behind the scenes, always several steps ahead of rivals and law enforcement. What separated Declan from other criminals was not just intelligence, it was vision. He understood that raw violence could only take a person so far in the criminal world, but money, carefully concealed and invested, could make him untouchable. With laundrettes generating a constant flow of laundered cash, he began to explore other avenues: small investment firms, property purchases, and front businesses. Each one seemed mundane enough to avoid scrutiny, yet each was another thread in a growing web designed to shelter wealth from the law. Despite the growing size of his empire, Declan's personal life remained a mystery. Neighbors might see a car in his driveway or note the occasional designer watch on his wrist, But few could guess the scale of the empire he commanded. He was meticulous, calculating and patient, traits that would later become the nightmare for anyone attempting to unravel his operations. By 2017, what had begun as a small, cautious venture had become a sprawling shadow network, one that funneled millions of pounds through the city's veins without anyone outside his inner circle suspecting a thing. It was in this delicate balance of ambition, intelligence, and secrecy that Declan, the Ledger Corwin, rose. The docks, once merely a symbol of Liverpool's commerce, had become the silent witness to the birth of a kingpin whose reach extended far beyond the streets. No one knew the full scale of his operations yet, but the first hints of an empire were already taking shape, waiting for the world to notice and for law enforcement to catch up. In those early days, Declan's shadow was just beginning to stretch, touching corners of the city that would soon bear the marks of his financial genius and his madness. By the time Declan the Ledger Corwin had established his initial foothold, his ambitions had grown far beyond laundrettes and small street networks. He understood that true power was not measured in how many drugs one sold on a Saturday night, but in how cleverly one could transform dirty money into a lifestyle that looked untouchable. It was the illusion of legitimacy that made him dangerous, the careful construction of an empire where every property, every business and every luxury item masked a layer of criminal sophistication. Declan began investing in real estate, a world he had studied with the same meticulous care he applied to spreadsheets and transactions. He purchased properties in Liverpool's more affluent districts, particularly along the coast in Crosby. On paper, these were investments under innocuous names, obscure corporate entities, trusts registered in neighboring counties, and even companies set up in offshore accounts. But in reality, these homes were a way to launder tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of pounds at a time. A single property might receive multiple streams of income disguised as rent, consulting fees or management services, creating an intricate web that left auditors and regulators scratching their heads. Property alone was not enough for Declan. He craved a lifestyle that reflected the empire he was building, but every display had to be carefully calculated. Luxury cars appeared in his driveway, but they were always registered under front companies or associates, never directly in his name. Designer watches and rare art pieces were collected and displayed strategically, visible enough to impress and intimidate, but hidden behind a veil of legal ownership. Each acquisition was part of a larger plan, a way to cement his reputation while keeping law enforcement off balance. He threw lavish parties at his sprawling mansion on the outskirts of Liverpool, parties that would seem ordinary to a casual observer, yet were carefully choreographed to reinforce his image as a self-made entrepreneur rather than a criminal mastermind. Declan's rise did not go unnoticed in the city's criminal circles. Rival gangs began to whisper about the young man who moved money like a magician, and who seemed to operate entirely beyond their reach. Yet he avoided confrontation, preferring strategy over brute force. His enforcers were loyal, not because of fear alone, but because they understood that Declan's careful orchestration made him far more formidable than any thug with a gun. Violence was used sparingly, only when absolutely necessary, ensuring the empire expanded without drawing attention to the chaos that so often accompanies street-level crime. Diversifying his holdings became Declan's obsession. Front businesses were established across the city, tattoo parlors, cafes and small retail shops that seemed ordinary on the surface. Each served as another avenue to move and disguise illicit funds. A cafe in Toxteth would handle hundreds of thousands in cash weekly, none of which matched its actual sales. A tattoo studio became more than a place for ink. It was a hub for cash pickups and transfers, its daily business a perfect cover for the empire's financial veins. Even an antique shop in a quiet suburb played its role, funneling money through sales of high-end items purchased at inflated prices, all linked to shell companies carefully hidden from public records. What set Declan apart from others was not just the scale of his operations, but the audacity and creativity with which he conducted them. He moved money across borders, using offshore accounts in the Isle of Man and the Channel Islands, while layering transactions through multiple companies, making it nearly impossible to trace the flow of funds. At every step he remained several moves ahead, anticipating audits, rival inquiries, and law enforcement tactics. Every decision was calculated, every purchase, every transfer part of a strategy to remain untouchable. Yet the life of opulence came with its own dangers. Declan's visibility grew alongside his empire, attracting attention both from law enforcement and from ambitious rivals who saw his wealth as a target. Friends and associates who once admired his genius began to whisper doubts, uneasy about the scale of the operations. But Declan thrived in the tension, understanding that the facade of wealth was as much a weapon as it was a shield. His parties, cars, properties, and luxury goods were not merely symbols of success, they were part of a calculated display to reinforce his untouchable image. By the end of this phase, Declan's empire was a labyrinth of financial maneuvers, front companies and property holdings that spanned the city and beyond. Liverpool had never seen anything like it. A criminal kingpin who could blend the worlds of high finance and street-level crime, who could throw a party in a mansion while moving millions in cocaine profits through a network of cafes, tattoo parlors, and investment firms. The city's law enforcement agencies were aware of the whispers, the rumors, and the sudden rise of a shadow figure whose name would soon become infamous. But they had yet to unravel the full scale of Declan's empire. In those years he was untouchable, a man who had turned crime into a form of art and whose every move was both a risk and a masterstroke. If you want, I can now expand Chapter 3 in the same detailed, suspenseful style, focusing on law enforcement starting to trace Declan's empire and the unraveling of the financial maze. Declan, the ledger, Corwin, had built his empire with meticulous precision. But every empire leaves traces, and the law has a way of finding even the most careful operators. By 2018, Liverpool's police had begun to notice patterns, unusual property purchases, cash-heavy businesses reporting modest earnings, and offshore companies with Liverpool connections that didn't add up. Enter Detective Inspector Marla Sweeney, a financial puzzle. Declan remained mostly unaware that the walls were closing in. He continued to move with calculated confidence, unaware that Sweeney's team was uncovering his digital and financial footprints, one by one. Every transfer, every property purchase, and every luxury acquisition provided another clue. Slowly, the facade of legitimate wealth began to show tiny cracks. Investigators started mapping relationships between companies, tracing payments to accounts previously thought unrelated, and identifying associates whose loyalty was more fragile than Declan had assumed. By mid-2019, Sweeney and her team had a clearer picture of the empire than anyone had imagined possible. The network spanned the city, linking laundrettes, cafes, tattoo studios and investment firms to a single individual, Declan Corwin. The scale of the operation stunned even veteran detectives. It was no longer a matter of suspicion. They had tangible evidence that money from drug trafficking was being methodically disguised as legal business revenue. Every spreadsheet, every transaction, and every shell company was another step toward dismantling the empire. Yet despite the mounting evidence, Declan remained elusive. He was always several moves ahead, his empire designed to withstand scrutiny. But Sweeney knew that even the most intricate systems have weaknesses. Every complex structure contains a flaw, a point where one miscalculation or one piece of overlooked evidence can bring the entire operation crashing down. The investigation had reached a critical juncture. It was only a matter of time before that flaw would be found, and the facade of legitimacy built by Liverpool's most enigmatic criminal would finally start to crumble. By 2019, the empire of Declan, the ledger, Corwin was reaching a scale that few in Liverpool could fully comprehend. For years he had operated almost untouchably, moving millions through laundrettes, cafes, tattoo studios and shell companies. His wealth had become ostentatious in subtle ways, luxury cars parked discreetly at front company addresses, rare watches in carefully photographed settings, and properties that on the surface appeared to belong to ordinary investors. Yet the very visibility that Declan cultivated for influence would soon become the vulnerability that would threaten everything he had built. The first cracks appeared not because of his ostentation, but because of a minor oversight, a misfiled tax document for one of his West Derby properties. The report contained inconsistencies that drew the attention of financial investigators working under Detective Inspector Marla Sweeney. While the error seemed trivial to most, it was enough to trigger a deeper examination. Surveillance teams were dispatched, tracking deliveries to the property and observing activity patterns. Luxury goods were arriving regularly, designer electronics, high-end furniture and rare art pieces. But none of these purchases matched any reported business activity. It was a small detail that hinted at something far larger. Declan's empire, sprawling and meticulously disguised, had begun to leave faint trails. Meanwhile, tensions within the criminal underworld started to ripple through Declan's carefully controlled network. Rival gangs noticed the opulence he displayed and began whispering about his empire, questioning whether someone was accumulating too much power. These murmurs, while seemingly inconsequential, were amplified by minor missteps in his operations, including delayed payments and unusual cash flows through front businesses. Declan, who had always relied on loyalty and discretion, now faced the subtle threat of exposure from both outside observers and internal associates. The world he had built on secrecy and deception was beginning to show signs of strain, and the pressure was mounting. The breakthrough came when one of Declan's most trusted accountants, Hugo Vance, made a fateful decision. Pressured by the weight of evidence mounting against him and fearing personal liability, Vance began cooperating with law enforcement. He provided detailed spreadsheets, corporate structures, and transaction histories that mapped Declan's empire with unprecedented clarity. Suddenly, the police could see the full extent of the web: dozens of shell companies, multiple offshore accounts, and a network of front businesses, all interconnected, all designed to obscure the flow of illicit funds. It was a moment of revelation for the investigators, who now had the blueprint needed to dismantle the empire systematically. Using the information from Vance, Detective Inspector Sweeney's team identified weak points in the network. Some properties were found to have dual ownership that hadn't been properly disclosed. Certain bank transfers were traced back to accounts in the Channel Islands and Isle of Man, linking front companies to Declan directly. Investigators even discovered that a seemingly innocent tattoo studio had been used to move hundreds of thousands of pounds in cash between locations, disguised as regular revenue. Every discovery reinforced a growing realization: Declan's meticulous empire, while formidable, was not invincible. While law enforcement worked to piece together the financial maze, Declan remained confident in his control, unaware that his shadowy operations were being exposed. He continued to move funds, purchase assets, and maintain the illusion of legitimacy. However, subtle signs of vulnerability began to creep into his behavior. Communications with associates became more cautious, property visits more infrequent, and reliance on intermediaries increased. Even the smallest errors, missed meetings, overlooked filings, or delayed transfers, now carried amplified risk. Each tiny lapse provided investigators with an opportunity to close the net tighter around him. By late 2019, the situation had reached a critical tipping point. Declan's empire, once unassailable, had been mapped in detail, and law enforcement was poised to act. Every asset he had acquired, every transaction he had hidden behind layers of corporate disguise, and every luxurious item used to bolster his image was now traceable. What had seemed like invulnerability was revealed to be a careful illusion, one that depended entirely on the silence of a few trusted associates and the complexity of financial misdirection. The revelation was simple yet profound. Even the most sophisticated criminal networks contained points of failure, and Declan's carefully constructed empire was no exception. The final weeks before the takedown were a tense chess game. Investigators monitored movements, froze accounts, and prepared coordinated raids. Declan, unaware of how thoroughly his empire had been exposed, continued his daily routines, moving through Liverpool as if untouchable. The cracks in his facade had widened just enough for law enforcement to see a clear path to dismantle his operations. Within days, the meticulously built empire, years in the making, would face its ultimate test. A test that would determine whether Declan, The ledger Corwin remained untouchable, or would finally fall to the weight of his own ambition. By early 2020, everything was in place. Detective Inspector Marla Sweeney's team had mapped the entire network of Declan, the ledger Corwin, with precision. Every front business, offshore account, property holding and hidden transfer had been documented. Years of patient investigation had transformed vague suspicions into an actionable plan. It was time to move. For the first time, Declan's carefully constructed world, the empire he had built on secrecy, deception, and meticulous planning, would be fully exposed. The operation began at dawn. Teams of investigators and financial crime specialists descended on properties across Liverpool simultaneously. Mansions in Crosby were surrounded, cafes and tattoo studios sealed, and corporate offices raided. Officers moved quickly but quietly, minimizing disruption while ensuring no assets could be moved or destroyed. In every location, the same pattern emerged. Luxury cars parked in driveways, rare artwork and designer furniture in homes, stacks of documents and ledgers hidden in offices, all pieces of the empire that had allowed Declan to operate undetected for years. Each discovery reinforced what the investigators already knew. This was the work of a man who had combined street-level criminality with the precision of a corporate strategist. As the raids unfolded, it became clear just how extensive Declan's laundering network had been. Laundrettes, once thought to be small, ordinary businesses, were revealed as hubs for funneling millions. Cash was meticulously documented, but every entry masked the true source of the funds. Cafes and retail shops, some run by unwitting staff, had been used to circulate money between accounts and properties. Every detail uncovered told the story of a criminal who had mastered the art of concealment, turning illicit profits into an image of legitimacy and prosperity. It was both staggering and methodical, a testament to Declan's intelligence and obsession with control. Despite the careful planning, the operation had an emotional weight for law enforcement. Investigators walked through rooms filled with luxury and excess, symbols of a lifestyle built entirely on the suffering and exploitation caused by the drug trade. Designer watches and high-end electronics were juxtaposed with evidence of ledger entries detailing wholesale cocaine purchases. The contrast was stark, a reminder that the glittering facade of wealth was built on a foundation of crime. Each seized asset, each traced transfer, and each documented transaction represented not just financial victory, but the